let me just start with you, Jake, if I may. We're really at a very critical moment, it seems to me, for the world order, in a sense, in that what happened in the Oval Office on Friday sent shockwaves around the world about whether America was going to continue being with Europe when it came to issues like the invasion of a sovereign democratic European country by a Russian dictator. How concerned are you that we might see a genuine fracturing here?
Last Friday was shocking, but unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance just trashed the 80-year transatlantic partnership that has kept all of us safe in the Western world. And now all of our allies are asking, can we trust Donald Trump? Can we trust the United States? Are they a good faith partner? Canada is already preparing for the worst. And now all of our partners in Europe, as well as our partners in the Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, the entire democratic world is wondering, will the United States honor their commitments? If a treaty has been signed by the US Congress, Donald Trump can't arbitrarily break it. That's in violation of federal and international law. But right now, Donald Trump says, I have the power to do whatever I want. I can make law. I can discern what the law is. Nobody can stop me. Nobody can check me. And we've entered a new age. I don't think anyone alive today really remembers what it was like back in the age of empires, prior to World War I, prior to World War II. And that's what Donald Trump and the Putinists in our own government want to do. The United States wants to ally. Our government wants to ally with Russia against our smaller, weaker, democratic, traditional allies. These alliances were built on shared values, respecting democracy, international law, human rights, three things that Donald Trump doesn't care about, three things that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about. And if the American people don't rise up now and put a stop to this, then we're going to have a lot more wars.
Okay.
A lot more wars, as Xi wants to redraw the maps, Putin wants to redraw the maps, and Trump wants to redraw the maps.
Okay. Andrew Wilson, your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, more panic mongering from the stupid leftists. So anything they can do to say, oh, Zelensky's a hero. This guy, by the way, the paradox of freedom, who's pressing people into service in his country, don't want to go while he's in a great battle for freedom. He went to the White House and completely embarrassed himself. He decided to have a massive argument in front of the American people, which should not have happened, in the middle of trying to get some type of peace treaty together on behalf of his own nation. Do leftists hold him accountable? Of course not. Instead, somehow, it's always Donald Trump's fault. By the way, this is our treasure, my money that's going over to Ukraine in order to fund this rapidly growing bloodbath that you so desperately want. Well, at the same time, you say, well, Andrew, don't you think that it's all because Putin is so bad? It's like, look, there's no good guys here. Stop pretending that I need to follow this dialectic, that there's good guys who are involved in this. Ukraine was always a corrupt government. The Russian government's a corrupt oligarchical government, and they're at war with each other. And I don't want my treasure to go over there, and I don't want my kids to go over there and fight a war. I'm sorry, but I think that we will refrain from entering into another European theater. As you bring up, people don't really understand what it was like, in these pre-imperial dynasties. Yeah, the thing is like, we do have grandparents or great-grandparents left alive who were part of these European theaters, and they were bloodbaths, absolute bloodbaths. And what we need right now is a peace treaty, not any more of your, cocksure posturing about, the good guy Zelensky and the bad guy Putin. It's a false dialectic, and I'm sick of it.
Dave Smith, it's very interesting to me to see the difference between the way a lot of people in America are viewing all this, particularly the Oval Office showdown, and the way countries like the UK here or other European countries are viewing it. But ultimately, everybody would like to see peace. Do you think we're more or less near to a peace settlement than we were before Friday?
Oh, I think we're closer to one, and I think that's great. And Andrew is spot on. And look, I mean, I know I've said this before on your show, Piers, here, but when you hear this fear mongering about the Putinists in our government, I mean, look, at least during Joseph McCarthy in the Senate and in the House on Un-American Activities, during what is known now as McCarthyism, at least back then there were some actual communists The idea that there are Putinists within our government is just ridiculous. And, you know, I love how everybody freaks out when Donald Trump is doing what is the scariest thing in DC, talking about potentially ending a war. And then we hear these lectures about like the power of the president. Meanwhile, you know, Barack Obama, not that long ago, forget, obviously, the Constitution is very clear that Congress has to declare a war. We haven't declared a war since World War II, but at least George W. Bush got like some authorizations from the Congress. Barack Obama went to war in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, not even anything from Congress. And we don't hear a freak out about like the power of the president until one is actually discussing the possibility of ending a war. And look, I mean, what Zelensky did in the Oval Office has got to be the greatest strategic blunder that I've ever seen in my life. For him to think that when he is in a desperate situation, completely reliant on Donald Trump, he thought the way to accomplish this was to go in there and try to out-alpha Donald Trump in a language he barely speaks. I mean, he did the biggest disservice to his own country and this entire effort. But you know what? I'm fine with that, because the whole thing is that America was never supposed to be a global empire, and the American people don't want to be a global empire. We're supposed to be a constitutionally limited republic, and there is no such thing as a constitutionally limited world empire. We should get out of the empire business. It's been nothing but a disaster for the American people.
Well, let me bring in Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired US commander in Europe. General, great to have you on Uncensored. You've heard there the conflicting views. From your perspective, with all your extensive military background, what did you make, first of all, of what you saw in the Oval Office on Friday?
Well, thanks for the privilege. And extensive military service is another way of saying I'm really old. So thanks for the euphemism.
My apologies for the ageist way I framed that.
Look, I have to say, Friday was one of the hardest days for me I've had in a long time. It was very difficult to watch how President Zelensky was treated in there. And look, you could criticize his, as Dave just did, you know, the fact that he pushed back there in the Oval Office. But you know what? I mean, he's leading a country that's fighting for its survival, and he was being bombarded with absolute false information. And it also revealed to me, or made it clear to me, that the people around the president do not understand the nature of war or why people fight. This notion that, look, you got to stop, you don't have the cards. George Washington sure didn't have the cards. The Taliban didn't have the cards. The Vietnamese did not have the cards, but yet all of them defeated much larger, technically superior forces. And so I think that what's missing from this is a clarity of what is our strategic objective. What are we trying to accomplish? What do we want in Europe? Why does Ukraine matter? It's not charity, obviously. It's because the Chinese are watching to see, are we serious when we talk about respect for sovereignty, respect for international law, respect for freedom of navigation. And if the Chinese see that we're not even willing to do this in Europe, then I don't think they'll be very impressed with what we say and do in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, our economy is tied to Europe. The biggest trading bloc in the world, or the trading relationship, is between Europe and the United States. And so if Ukraine fails, you're going to see about another 10 million Ukrainian refugees heading into Poland and Germany and Western Europe. That affects us. So the Biden administration failed to do it. The Trump administration has not yet done it, to say our strategic objective.
Before I go to Andrew to respond to that, General, just from a pure military perspective, is there any way Ukraine can either win this war with enough support or chuck Russia out of the 20% of Ukraine it's currently occupying? Are either of those two things remotely achievable?
Absolutely. Look, this war has been going on 11 years. 11 years, and Russia still, with every advantage, only controls 20% of Ukraine. They have gone a total of 60 kilometers in the last year from Avdiivka to the outskirts of Prokhorovsk. That's it. despite enormous advantages and huge casualties. The great Russian Black Sea Fleet, nobody even talks about them anymore. The Russian Air Force failed its two main tasks, achieve air superiority and interdict the lines of communication from Poland and Ukraine. They're not able to do it. So it's clear that the Russians do not have the ability to break through or overrun the Ukrainian defenders the way their grandfathers did in the Second World War. That just doesn't exist. So, and this is without the United States actually committing, or European countries actually committing to helping Ukraine win. You know, the Biden administration never could say, we want Ukraine to win. And so you ended up with this sort of drip, drip, drip support. And of course, I think if the Europeans are finally waking up, that they realize that they are going to pay an enormous price if Ukraine fails. And so about 50% of the ammunition that's produced in Europe today goes to customers in the Middle East and in Africa. So it's not like they don't have industrial capacity. They have not yet shown the political will or the strategic backbone to do what needs to be done.
Okay, and Andrew Wilson, some people on the conservative right in America want to see Zelensky resign and have somebody else to deal with here. What do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, he suspended all elections in his nation and probably shouldn't be the sitting president.
But hang on. On that point, though, just to be clear, the country remains under martial law. So it was supposed to have an election, I think, last April, May.
If this happened here in the United States, these guys would be screaming bloody murder, that Trump was a dictator, that he was a neo-Nazi, that he was a fascist authoritarian. If this happened under martial law in the United States, these guys would be screaming for blood right now. For some reason, though, when it's Zelensky, it's fine because it's under martial law. That makes it all better. They can press people into service. That's okay. They don't mind that.
But how could they? Okay, but how could they? But Andrew, how could they realistically have a free and fair election, given that 6.5 million Ukrainians have left the country as refugees?
Perhaps they could.
Hang on. Let me finish. 3.5 million more are living under Russian occupation, so clearly can't vote freely or fairly in the way they may wish to. Plus, they're still at war, so there's a front line which has thousands and thousands more Ukrainians battling it out every day who wouldn't be able to vote either. How does this election even happen? Never mind the fact that under their constitution, which got parliamentary massive support, dictates they can't have an election while they're under martial law anyway. But how do you have a free, fair election, given those set of circumstances?
Yeah, perhaps you couldn't, though there are war-torn regions before which have had elections. But let's just grant for a second that you couldn't. So what? These guys would still be screaming bloody murder if the shoe was on the other foot here in the United States, and it was impossible for us to do a free and fair election.
Nobody did when the UK.
They would still be screaming about it.
But nobody did when the UK didn't have an election for 10 years before and during World War II. Everybody understood. There was no criticism of that. There was a realization.
A different era with people who weren't lunatics, and now the left is a bunch of lunatics, and they apply a double standard, and they have what is called the paradox of freedom. And right now, they don't care that people are being pressed into the front lines. He brings up Washington, who was using a volunteer militia. Nobody was getting pressed into service in order to fight off the British. These people are lunatics, and they're bloodthirsty monsters, ultimately. Anytime we try to move towards peace, as Dave Smith rightly points out, these people want to do everything possible to not do that because, Putin might get a W. It's like, look, ultimately, I'm going to say this again, reiterate it again. Neither one of these are the good guys. Ukraine has a corrupt government, has a history of corruption. The Putin and Russia, history of corruption, very, very bad countries doing very bad things to each other. The Europeans didn't, if they cared so much, how come they only recently started to actually fund this? When Trump got into office,
I agree with you.
There was only 4 of them, 4 countries, including ours, that even had 3% of its GDP going to this conflict until Trump demanded it. So it's like, no, I don't buy this narrative that, we've always cared about our tree. You cared when our treasure's going over there and funding the entire thing, right? Suddenly there's a blank check. I'm sure that the corrupt Ukrainian government loves having our blank checks go over there where they pocket half of it and only half of it goes to the war effort. I don't trust any of these people.
All right, Jake, I mean, there's no doubt, I said this from the moment Donald Trump first started talking about NATO being potentially obsolete if the member countries didn't pay their basic financial dues, which they weren't doing in the main. There's no doubt, given how many more are now paying their dues or more, that memo got loudly received. But Europe is still, most countries, including this country, UK, have not been stepping up properly on their own defences. And there comes a point, does there not, where I completely understand why a lot of Americans are simply done with being the global police officer. Why should they be? If the Europeans aren't prepared to take their own defences seriously enough, why should America constantly feel obliged to come in and spend American taxpayer money on bailing them out?
The honest answer is because America has been writing the security policy for these countries since World War II. If America makes all the decisions, America calls the shots in this alliance, what incentive is there for our allies to spend increased amounts? Should they have been meeting that 2% NATO guideline? Of course they should, but they were lulled into a false sense of security, both from the United States and from the Russians. This entire plan of making Europe dependent on Russian energy exports, nations that trade together don't go to war with each other, we now know that's a lie. This was a post-communist collapse experiment. What if we economically intertwined ourselves with the Chinese, with the Russians? We make this globalization effort in order to connect them. That way, they won't want to risk their trade partners in order to go to war with their neighbors. And what we've learned in the last 3 years is that we were wrong. We never should have made our economy, our energy needs dependent on either the Chinese or the Russians, because they're dictatorships and they're authoritarians and they want to be empires. They want to invade their smaller, weaker neighbors or topple their governments, either create proxy states or redraw the maps. So now nobody can deny the reality. Nobody can deny the truth. Every democracy in the world has to reevaluate their trade partnerships and their food and energy supplies, because you cannot be reliant on dictators. You cannot be reliant on either China or Russia, because they will use those trade relations as leverage to get what they want on the battlefield, to get concessions from democratic nations that do try to negotiate in good faith. When the Russians and the Chinese will never negotiate in good faith. They will always make maximum demands. They will always lie. They will always cheat. They will always steal. You can't trust them. You shouldn't be working with them. And right now, Donald Trump is trying to negotiate an aluminum deal with the Russians. Donald Trump is trying to resume direct flights between the United States and Moscow on stolen planes. All of these aircraft that the Russians stole 3 years ago, Donald Trump wants to pretend like it never happened. We're trying to increase diplomatic staff when we know these people are all FSB agents and spies here just to subvert, undermine, and weaken the United States. Donald Trump is opening up the gates and making every American less safe and our country weaker. This has been a disaster the last 3 days, and Donald Trump and JD Vance are the ones driving all of this right now.
Okay, I mean, Dave Smith, I would not share some of that categorization, because I don't think this is by any means done, this scenario. I think that Trump ultimately is desperate to bring peace. He prefers peace to war. He said he'd do this before he came into office. He wants to get it done, as he does in Gaza as well. He wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. There are lots of incentives here for Donald Trump to deliver on what he said he would deliver on. So I don't share that slightly apocalyptic view of where we are. But I also think Jake makes some very good points about, you know, when you dance with the devil, you get pricked by the horns. And a lot of people believe that the way Donald Trump interacts with people like Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un and others is detrimental to America's national interest. What do you feel?
I mean, global politics always involves interacting with bad people, and it only seems like the propaganda about this, arises when it's somebody who we want to support a war against. You know, there's how about the way we interact with the Saudis or the Israelis, for that matter? Look, the greatest thing that ever happened in the history of the world has happened over the last 30 years, and there's 1 billion people have been pulled out of extreme poverty, and a big part of that was because Richard Nixon went and talked to Mao Zedong, the most evil man who ever lived by the numbers. And so, look, I just think there's always this fear mongering that is associated with every single war. And, you mentioned age before. I'm old enough to have lived through a lot of these wars right now. America's been in a constant state of war since at least 9/11. And of course, we know that, with the war in Iraq, it was going to be a mushroom cloud over Kansas, right? Saddam Hussein was going to give the weapons that he didn't have to the terrorists he wasn't friends with. And then they were going to nuke America. And they convinced everyone in America that this was the case. And we hear the same thing now. Although weirdly, there seems to be something so contradictory here between making the argument that Vladimir Putin is so weak that he can't even take over Ukraine, even though he's been at war with them since 2014, or however you want to calculate when the war actually started. And yet also he's some huge threat to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Or we just hear it asserted that China will move on Taiwan if Vladimir Putin gets to keep his percentage of Ukraine, which I'm not even saying is impossible, but it's certainly not an inevitability. By the way, I don't think we could do anything if China wanted to move on Taiwan tomorrow. And right. I think Americans have to get out of this mindset, this empire mindset. Like, just for example, imagine, let's just say there was the political will and there was the desire. Let's say that the U.S. wanted to take Mexico City. We had decided we're going to do that. What could Russia do to stop us? What could China do to stop us? Nothing. The idea is ridiculous. If we decided we wanted to do that, then we do that, period, because we're the bigger, stronger country. And that's not great, but it is the way of the world. Look, the bottom line here is that people, and I will say like me at this point, because I've been talking about this conflict on big platforms for years at this point now, the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, I always get his name wrong, but he himself said that in late 2021, Vladimir Putin drafted a treaty between Russia and NATO, and what he was asking for was a promise that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And he said for that he would not invade. And the people like you just interviewed, the great Jeffrey Sachs before we started this panel, the people like that. That's the deal we could have had if we had listened to people like that. And now, oh my God, wouldn't you give anything for that deal? Imagine you could have all of Ukraine, minus Crimea, under Ukrainian control, and all you had to give was a promise of not bringing Ukraine into NATO. Now, NATO's not even on the table anymore, and there's no way Ukraine's going to keep 100% of its geographic integrity from the beginning of the war. This is the reality of the situation. Governments are not perfect, and neither is ours, but peace is better than war. This war did not need to happen, and it's been an absolute disaster, worst of all for the Ukrainian people.
On the issue of the election, I think it's worth noting, and I'll come to you, General, if I may, for a response to this, but Ukraine's parliament voted overwhelmingly to approve a resolution affirming the legitimacy of Zelensky's stay in office, asserting the constitutionality of deferring the presidential election while the country's at war. The 268 parliament members present voted unanimously to approve the resolution, while 12 other MPs were not present during the session. So that seems to me to be a very clear democratic mandate by the elected officials of Ukraine to endorse not having an election until the war is over.
Well, some of us may not like the fact that Ukrainian martial law includes a suspension of elections, but that is the law. And so, and then the fact that the Rada made the decision to vote and give that sort of public endorsement, to me, that's compelling. Now, I do want to say, give Dave Smith credit. I finally heard him say something today that I agreed with. This war could have been avoided if we, the West, led by the United States, had responded appropriately after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, if we had responded appropriately after they invaded Ukraine in 2014. And that's not a game. I mean, the whole world saw Russia invade Ukraine in 2014. And we did nothing when they jumped over the Obama red line in Syria. So this war is a result of failed deterrence. And trying to explain deterrence and spend money for deterrence is always a tough sell, because you have to convince taxpayers and voters and legislators of what the risk is and why you have to do it. That's hard, but it is much, much cheaper, obviously, to do that, to have successful deterrence, as we did for over 70 years after the Second World War, versus dealing with the failed deterrence we're dealing with right now. I think that for Andrew, I would just offer, I'm pretty sure you know this, the amount of money, the 120 to 180 billion, depending on what you include in that amount, it's clearly not 350, but the amount of money that the United States has spent or contributed towards helping Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of that money was spent in the United States. It's not pallets of ammunition, of money that are loaded onto a C-17 and then delivered into Ukraine. It's money that is spent replacing or buying ammunition, refurbishing old equipment that is then loaned or given to Ukraine. And of course, there are no U.S. troops in Ukraine except for those officers that are assigned to the embassy and the Office of Defense Cooperation, whose task is to make sure accountability of every javelin, every artillery round, every set of binoculars. Oh, you can shake your head if you want to. That's a fact. So
why don't you stop pretending that we don't have United States Special Forces on the ground right this second? We don't have CIA agents all over Ukraine right this second. Why don't you just stop pretending? Because it's nonsense. And we all know it's nonsense. This is the way, hang on, this is the way it's been going for a long time. And when you talk about, well, Andrew, what we're actually doing is we're spending a whole bunch of money on refurbishing equipment here instead of buying new equipment to send over there. So what? So why are you still spending tons of my money on something I don't care about to send over to a nation which is corrupt as hell? So can we just stop BSing each other for a second? Yes, the United States has boots on the ground there. Yes, we have special forces units there. We have CIA agents there, and we would be fools to pretend we don't.
It's an interesting argumentative style that you had, and I always, when people start calling me names or whatever, then I really, the credibility.
I didn't call you any names, sir. I didn't call you any names.
Whatever. Okay.
What was the name that I called you?
I think the key is this idea of trying to end the war.
Actually, just offended by tone. You just don't like tone. Maybe a little tone policing getting worked in there. Maybe that Southern drawl where you try to make yourself sound likable because you have it doesn't work so well on me because you can't gaslight me with this stuff. It's nonsense. Yes, there's boots on the ground there. Yes, there's been boots on the ground there probably since the beginning. Yes, we're spending $100 billion plus on equipment that we then either send over there. And by the way, there's hidden money going over there too. This is such nonsense. Just stop gaslighting the American people. Stop it. We're not stupid. We've seen this on repeat so many times now. So many times.
General, respond?
The idea of ending the war, of course, is exactly what we would like to do, but it needs to be an end that is sustainable. And I think President Zelensky understands that he can't just sign or accept an end to the war where Russia will wait for us to lose interest, because we always do lose interest, and then they pick right back up with a resumption of the conflict after we have left or turned our back. And so I think it's reasonable to expect the Ukrainians to want some sort of guarantee, whether that's continued aid, continued equipment, or presence. They haven't. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Obviously, I would prefer to see Ukraine in NATO. We get better the day they join NATO. It's not going to happen anytime soon, especially if the United States is not willing to do it, and the Biden administration also is not willing to do it. But how do we end it when you're the partner on the other side, negotiating partner on the other side of the table is Vladimir Putin? I mean, there's no reason to have confidence that they will live up to any agreement because there's nothing in their history. And I do appreciate that Andrew likes my North Florida accent.
Well,
let me bring in Dave. I want to bring in Dave. We've got.
Yeah, I never quite understand this argument that seems to just logically fall apart, that we can't end a war because the war might pick up at some point in the future, and therefore, if we don't have a perfect guarantee that, I mean, even if it, I mean, I don't know. I've heard the entire time through this war, including on your show, Piers, that if Putin was successful in Ukraine, then he was going to move on Poland, right? Like, this is what Joe Biden kept saying. This was the official, like, fear mongering of this war. And so if you're telling me that even NATO membership isn't a guarantee, then yes, we never have a perfect guarantee. By the way, you also don't have a guarantee from any government in the history of the world. That doesn't mean that ending a war isn't still a positive. And I just want to go back to what was, brought up initially. The idea that this was a case of failed deterrence, and that if only we had deterred Vladimir Putin sooner, then we could have avoided this whole thing. I mean, let's just kind of quickly overlook the last 20 years of U.S. foreign policy in Europe. We've expanded NATO all the way to Vladimir Putin's borders. We constantly floated out the idea for years that we would include Ukraine at some point, give them full membership. We said point blank in 2008 at the Bucharest summit that we were bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO before Russia ended up going to war with Georgia there. And then we look, Piers, like we've done this before on the show too, right? But just imagine, if you can, have a little bit of strategic empathy and put yourself in the Russians' shoes. If Russia, let's say the Soviet Union had never collapsed, and the Soviet Union had poured $100 million into a Mexican street protest that overthrew a democratically elected government, and they had been saying for years they were going to bring Mexico into their military alliance. And then when the new government came up, they recognized them immediately and started arming them, as Donald Trump foolishly bragged about the other day with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Piers, do you think Americans would feel that was deterrence, or do you think we might view that as a provocation? I mean, like, it's just,
Stop
by
using
the way,
logic,
when
Dave.
Donald
Stop
Trump...
using logic, Dave.
Well, look, when
let me
Donald
ask,
Trump
rather than me
was-
try and
very quickly,
answer a
very-
very logical question, let me get Jake to respond to that.
So the first thing that he said, what is the concern if Russia takes Ukraine? If Russia can't even go 60 kilometers deep and take the city of Pokrovsk, what is the threat to NATO? And it's, yes, absorbing a country of 40 million people, absorbing a country that has $10 trillion of natural resources under the ground. It's the strategic location on the Black Sea. If Russia absorbs Ukraine, they will Russify the people. They will annihilate the Ukrainian identity, turn them into Russians, and then start press ganging them into the military and send them into meat wave attacks against the Baltics, against Poland and the Suwalki Gap. We're trying to prevent Russia from getting stronger. And I don't care about what Russia thinks or feels. Russia is not a great power. Russia has an economy the same size roughly as Spain. Do you think Spain is a great power that the United States should respect?
Exactly, dude. Listen, we are in the business of trying to be a world empire, and we're going broke. We're $36 trillion in debt because we can't afford to do it. We've blown $8 trillion in the last 20 years on foreign wars.
Why is Donald Trump talking about invading Greenland? Why is Donald Trump talking about invading Panama?
I don't agree with that.
Why is Donald Trump talking about annexing Canada? Why is he talking about ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip? That is empire.
See, you lost
red herring.
you
It's
lost
a red
the
herring.
point.
Stay on
pushing
topic,
for
Liv.
America to be a
You
global
lost the
empire.
point, and
That's
now
a
you're
total
moving.
red herring. Total red herring.
Completely.
red
And by
herring.
the way, I don't
Like-
support.
like,
I don't
go
support
to-
Is
go
the
after
guy
the
who
argument.
smokes and spends all day arguing with strippers and OnlyFans girls going to speak up? I don't know
They
who
make
this
better
guy
arguments
is.
than you do,
General
bro.
Ben Hodges,
It's not my fault
thank
that you
so
have a
much
low
for your
IQ,
service to
lower
this
IQ
country.
than a stripper
You're
and an
hero.
OnlyFans
You're an
girl.
expert. These other guys, I can't take them serious.
Okay, well, I mean, listen, you just couldn't
okay.
respond
Well,
to my
you
point
need to have
at all
you need to have
there,
the right
dude.
pedigree
I mean,
in order
you
to make an argument, bro.
Say that you can't take me seriously, but you just completely didn't. You had no response to the argument. Listen, the current estimate I've seen is that Russia's GDP is about $2 trillion a year. Try to keep perspective on this. That is less than a third.
Is Spain a great power that we should respect? Is Italy a great power that we should respect?
Well, aren't we all missing? Okay,
This-
let me
hold
bring
on.
the elephant in the room into the debate. Nobody's mentioning the nuclear arsenal that Russia has. That's what makes it different to any of these other countries. Russia, on its own, has more nukes than any other country, including the United States. That is a fact. There are, I think, 9 countries in the world that have nukes. The UK has some. France has some. There are American nukes at a number of other European countries. But let's be clear, when it comes to deterrent, there's probably only one deterrent that Putin really cares about, and that is a nation that is nuclear armed. And when I interviewed, and I'll bring the general in here for this, when I interviewed President Zelensky 2 weeks ago, he did say as part of the security that he wanted, maybe we could have our nuclear weapons back. Because, of course, when Ukraine became an independent country, they had a lot of Russian nuclear missiles on their territory, a lot. And they agreed to give them all back to Russia, but only because Russia, America, and the UK gave undertakings that they would be guaranteed defense. And that hasn't materialized. And so you could argue, if you go right back to the start of all this, from when Ukraine went out on its own, had they been allowed to keep some of those nuclear missiles that were Russian-owned but were on Ukraine territory, had they been able to keep them and remain a nuclear power, that might have been the only thing that would have deterred Vladimir Putin. Now, what would you say to that?
Well, of course, you have to take Russia's nuclear capabilities seriously. They have a lot of them. They don't care how many innocent people might be killed. But I think that it was a mistake of the Biden administration to assume that if Ukraine was successful or we did too much, that Russia might retaliate with a nuclear weapon of some sort. And I think there was never a chance they were going to do that because there was no benefit to the Russians to use.
But would Russia have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had retained some of the nuclear weapons they had to give up back in the mid-90s?
Well, that's a fair question to ask, but I don't know. I mean, having a nuclear force is incredibly expensive. Almost half of UK's defense budget is tied up just in their nuclear force. So could Ukraine have managed to continue a nuclear deterrent that was modernized, ready, prepared, when in fact, it's not just about having those big silver bullets. It's also the whole system to be able to deliver it. And I'm not sure that that's I can't answer that with any sort of assurance. But nuclear deterrence, this has always been one of the most important contributions of the United States to NATO was the nuclear capability that we brought, as well as what UK and France possess as well. So we do live in a nuclear world. I think it was unfortunate that we allowed ourselves to be deterred by Russian threats of nuclear weapons, because now everybody else that wants a nuke or has one or is trying to get one sees that we could be deterred by just the threat of the use
I
of
totally agree. I was saying that actually throughout the entire time. Every time Putin was in a bit of a hot situation, he'd just rattle his nuclear saber in a threatening and aggressive manner.